You can be seen on the projector and you can be heard by the audience. So you are welcome without any hesitation because we are late and sorry for being late. I would like to ask you, Daniele Albertazzi, who is assistant professor or professor, I don't really remember, you will tell us, at the University of Birmingham, and he will speak about the Italian situation, or in more general terms about populism. We already discussed that I suggested an original title which would have been The Turnover of Populists in Italy, but Daniele protested, arguing that there is no such turnover in Italy in spite of the fact that there are two populist parties in power at the moment in Italy. So I'm very eager to learn your arguments, why there is no such a risk, and maybe the export of Italian populism under Matteo Salvini, whether it's a risk. We already discussed it a little bit, the spreading of populism all over in Europe, and Salvini is certainly one of the key players in that competition, who is the best populist in Europe at the moment. So the floor is yours. Please go ahead. You have about 20 minutes or so, and I ask the audience also to listen carefully, and please go ahead with your presentation, Daniele.
Okay, well, first, thanks very much for inviting me. I'm sorry I cannot be there in person. I was going to start talking about populism and liberal democracy, but let me address your points first quickly, and then I'm sure we might have to go back to them in the Q&A session. My point to you was that I don't find the situation in Italy like a particularly new development, in the sense that I regard Italy as one of the populist paradises in Europe, alongside countries such as Switzerland, and therefore I always stress to people who tell me, oh, the Lega is in government, that the Lega has been in government 5 times. This is the 5th time. So we can discuss this later. I'm not trying to play down the threat to liberal democracy posed by the Italian government at the moment. In fact, it was one of the topics of my speech. But what I'm saying is that I don't think that there is an awful lot that is new in Italy. Second point, in terms of Salvini and now creating this common front, my reply to this point will be that what Salvini is doing is focused entirely on the domestic market. Of course, there is an opportunity that these parties will take for more collaboration at the European level, and I'm sure that some of them will manage to join in the same group. But we know also that there are very different interests of these parties, precisely because many of them are not just populists but also nationalists. And the most obvious example is that some of these parties have a very, very different opinion about the role that Russia should play in its relationship with Europe. So, although I can see why there is a lot of talk about this initiative by Salvini, I read it as something that he's doing to be seen within Italy as a leader in Europe. And the fact that he's Minister of the Interior and Deputy Prime Minister, of course, gives him a platform for doing that. But I don't regard Salvini or the Lega as parties or leaders who are particularly interested in what happens in the European Parliament. No, I regard Salvini as somebody who places a great importance on the relationship between Italy and the EU. I think he regards the EU as a great target for political speeches, but when it comes then to starting a real fight with the EU, the Italian government, including this government, will step back. It has always done that, and it's done that again a few months ago. So I close this parenthesis because you provoked me, and now very, very briefly, just saying what I was meant to say, and then we'll discuss it. Unless you want to discuss it now.
No, go ahead.
So,
go ahead.
I was very interested in looking at your program, and of course there is a lot to say about populism and liberal democracy in Europe. And of course, given where you are, I was even more interested. Because when I read, I tend to read, for instance, The Conversation a lot, the academic blog. When I read about Hungary, I tend to find quotes such as the ones that I'm going to read to you now. One article, will Hungary infect the rest of Europe? Another one, Western Europe has looked in exasperation at the political trajectory of Hungary, Poland and other former communist states. Another one, the roots of democracy in Hungary are shallow. And your opening speech, indeed, was called the urbanization of Europe. Now, I do not play down in any way the seriousness of the situation in Hungary or indeed in Poland. I'm absolutely convinced that there is a very powerful threat being posed in these countries to some fundamental principles of liberal democracy. But what I would say is that there are powerful threats being posed to these principles all over Europe, and that the populist parties that, in my view, pose these threats have actually started growing in Western Europe before the end of the Soviet Union and before in Central and Eastern Europe the political systems started to change. Whether it's France or Scandinavia or indeed the first Berlusconi government in the mid-90s, the populism in Western Europe has been growing and very healthy for a long time. My argument is that it's populism, in fact, populism as such, that is incompatible with liberal democracy. It's not an original argument, but I think it's a very powerful one. Populists see the people as homogeneous and construct a people as homogeneous. They also construct the people as homogeneous by trying to limit other voices that do not go along with what they see as the kind of dominant view of the people, opinion of the people. But in my view, the fundamental, important ingredient of liberal democracy, what makes liberal democracy liberal, is the principle of the necessary limitation and constraints which are put on the power of the executive. So that is kind of starting point. Liberal democracy sees society as being inevitably plural, and therefore focuses entirely on the idea that the power of the majority, the majority of the day, has to be limited and has to be constrained. In my view, that is precisely what puts it on a collision course with populism, because if you have populism, whether you conceive it as an ideology or, as Marco Tarchi says in Italy, a mentality or a style, whatever, but no one in our academics agree that there are some fundamental ingredients of this either discourse or style or ideology, and the fundamental ingredient is indeed to conceive the people or to posit the people as homogeneous and united, and to say that the executive should be implementing a will of the people, which is argued to be easy to identify. So, division of powers, constraints put on the power of the executive, the idea that the constitution has primacies, that for the varying majorities of the day can never really go beyond certain principles which are set in a constitution. And indeed, the idea that the rights of minorities are sacred, all these are ideas that are fundamental to liberal democracy, that populists, not just right-wing populists, not just nativist populists, but populists cannot digest and will not digest. That's how I see it. And to make this point with reference to Italy, which is, as I already mentioned, a populist paradise, because you wouldn't understand the 5-star if you don't know anything about Berlusconi. To make this point with reference to Italy, and even leaving aside what you already know, which is very well known about the unhealthy relationship between Berlusconi and the media, So leaving that aside, when one looks at what Berlusconi has done in government, has been a systematic and constant attack against the principles of liberal democracy. And I've got some examples here. I'm sure you've heard about many of them. 2003, the approval of legislation halting all trials involving the highest offices of the state, President, Prime Minister, President of the Constitutional Court, which was, of course, legislation passed only for one purpose. There was only one person who was in charge of one of the highest offices of the state who was being put on trial. That was the Prime Minister. He wasn't the President, he wasn't the President of the Constitutional Court. So it was all done to protect Berlusconi from being put on trial. And this is a fundamental challenge to the idea of that we are all equal in terms of the law, but also the fundamental principles of the division of power, which means that, of course, the justice system might have to investigate the holders of the executive power. Now, this was struck down by the Constitutional Court. After 2 years, 2005, new law modified the statute of limitation in Italy, leading in 2012 to the collapse of the trial in which Berlusconi was accused of having bribed the British lawyer David Mills. This was not struck down by the Constitutional Court. In fact, Berlusconi continued to walk freely in the streets. In 2008, another attempt to pass legislation to grant immunity to the 4 highest offices of the state, including the Prime Minister, again struck down by the Constitutional Court. And this is to kind of mention some examples of the challenge in Italy towards the idea of the separation of power. It's very, very important to look at how all of this was justified, because Berlusconi is, in my view, the embodiment of populism, and from the very first day that he took to the picture of politics, as he famously said. And he justified this by saying, well, it doesn't make sense that an unelected judge can interfere with me delivering the will of the people through a government that has been elected. And this is an argument that we've heard now hundreds of times around Europe in the last few years. It's so banal now. How can we accept that bodies that are not elected, or indeed external bodies, the European Court of Justice or whatever it might be, come here and limit the power of the executive, so stop us from delivering what is defined as the will of the people? Berlusconi was very open about this, and he was that was his argument. But if we look at the respect of minorities and human rights, then of course Italy is top of the list. One example, back in 2009, the introduction of the crime of illegal immigration, which was thrown out by the European Court of Justice 2 years later for breaching EU legislation safeguarding the rights of people facing deportation. So it was a legislation fundamentally anti-minorities and targeting foreigners. But I do get why people think that this government is underpinned by populist ideas, even more than previous governments. Of course, in the last year we've seen the famous policy of the porti chiusi, so the shutting down the ports, stopping ships at sea that carry would-be asylum seekers or would-be migrants that have been saved in the Mediterranean while trying to cross the Mediterranean. This in some ways reminds of Hungary's policy to bounce asylum seekers back into Serbia. It's something that has meant that ships have been stopped from reaching Italy for weeks and weeks, and Salvini was going to be put on trial for this, except that the Italian Senate did not authorize it. again, it's, in my view, a fundamental challenge to a basic idea when you think in terms of respecting, in this case, respecting human rights. Because, of course, what we are doing is to stop people who may have... the shores. If they don't reach the shores of Italy, they won't be able to do that. Can you hear me? Because I can see now it says poor connection. Yeah, you can. Okay.
We can still hear you.
Great. And because my argument is that this is not just about right-wing nationalist populism, but it's about populism as such. And again, you wanted, quite rightly, to discuss Italy. So another obvious example of these challenges, and I conclude the list, is this time the Five-Star Movement, that when they had to take a decision about whether to authorize the Salvini, the Minister Salvini being put on trial after there was a request by the investigating magistrates to do that. What they've done is to basically subcontract the decision to their members via an online poll of their members, when the Italian Constitution clearly states that, I mean, there is a reason why ministers and MPs are protected, which is that you want them to be free to do their job. So in case the magistrates want to investigate and put somebody on trial, then the Senate has to decide whether this should be authorized. So it's the senator who takes this decision. They have to take responsibility. It's very important, if you believe in the primacy of prostitution, that this kind of rules are followed and respected. Now, the moment in which a political party says, for a number of reasons that I understand, we can discuss them. I mean, it was very clever as a move. But in the moment in which they say, oh, we're actually going to ask the members of a party to take this decision, via an online poll where the platform, and this is in addition, this would already be a problem, but in addition to this, the platform that is being used is owned by a private company. Now, this is a fundamental threat to a principle that is an important principle, which is that if in the Constitution it says that if the Senate takes this kind of decision, then the Senate takes this kind of decisions. So, and I conclude, in my view, the attempt by populists to create these homogeneous people and posit these homogeneous people is the fundamental reason why populism will always be at odds with fundamental principles of liberal democracy. And in my view, populism is not necessarily a threat to any kind of democracy, but it's specifically a threat to liberal democracy. So we can conceive of the kind of populist version of democracy, in which democracy means the power of the majority. But we cannot conceive, in my view, of a populist party or leader that will ever be at ease with the liberal ingredients of liberal democracy that nowadays most people regard as essential. So when academics such as D. Klein in the Oxford Handbook of Populism say things like, and I quote, "The conflation of populism with nationalism in Western Europe has ultimately given populism a worse name than it deserves. Some of the contemporary critiques of populism are actually critiques of exclusionary nationalism. These critiques denounce populism not only for the potential threats of populism per se to liberal democracy, but also for sins that are not in fact populist, but are committed by some populists." Well, if the argument is that in academic speeches and in the media we often confuse populism and a specific version of populism, which is the populist radical right, then I agree, I go along with it, and I fully agree, we do. And journalists in particular do all the time. But if the argument is that it's only nationalist populism, or call it as you like, I call it populist radical right parties that pose a threat to liberal democracy, then I profoundly disagree. There are different contexts, different political systems, whatever you like, but when you identify populism, then almost always you find a problem, in fact, sometimes serious problems concerning liberal democracy. Serious when these parties are in government or provide support for the government. So populism indeed can give voice to excluded groups in certain contexts, thinking of South America. It can help politicizing issues that have previously been ignored by mainstream parties. Yes. All of this is true, it's part of the story, but it is, in my view, a fundamental symptom of the malfunctioning of liberal democracy. It's not a solution, and because of its commitment to the sovereign rule of the people as a homogeneous collective, it inevitably poses a fundamental threat to these principles. So I judge it to be so inimical to liberal democracy to nowadays pose one of the kind of most fundamental threats to it that we have in Europe today, but not just in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, as I was trying to say. Thank you.
May I be the first, and then I will ask the audience to be second, third, etc. If I understand you correctly, you said that all sorts of populisms, including populists who are not on the radical right side of the spectrum, are illiberal. So in that sense, they are all dangerous for liberal democracy. But my question is, are these populists still democratic? There are some people who would say that there is nothing like a non-liberal democracy in our age, and to constrain liberal democracy, the liberal part of democracy, you also constrain democracy. Without fair elections and without free media, for example, you don't have democracy anymore. So that would be my question. That is the first question. And who would like to join and have a... Zsuzsi helps me. Yes, please, Andrei, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Andrej Kolkes, Slovakia. Very interesting. And I have the two questions. One is, some argue that there are cases of neoliberal populism, particularly in Latin America countries, especially in early 2000s, I mean. And the second question would be, why Italy is then so called this populist paradise then? What is the problem there? And you answer partially this question with arguing that, which I agree with you, that it is the problem of dysfunctionality of political system. So why Italian political system has shown these features of dysfunctionality for decades, probably, right? That's the question. Is there any answer for that? Thank you.
I'm sure you have understood this, but I haven't understood the last two questions. I just can't hear them. If you can repeat them for me with the microphone.
I will try to interpret it very shortly, if Andrei agrees. It's the question of whether Italy is especially the homeland of populism. He understands and agrees, Andrei, that the political system is a main problem in Italy or regarding the spread of populism. So is Italy a special place for ongoing populism now for decades? And why is it so? That's the main question.
And the second was...
The second question?
Neoliberal populism. In some cases they argue there's neoliberal populism in Latin America in particular.
The second question was about neoliberal populism. Is there anything like that, especially from the experience of Latin America?
Okay, so my question would be quite specific actually. You mentioned in the very beginning of your talk this new attempt to form a radical right coalition in the European Parliament of Mr. Salvini. And my question would be, how would you explain the decision of the Danish People's Party and the Finns to actually sign up for this coalition, because it is quite a new development considering that these parties were sort of considered like the respectable radicals by like Professor MacDonald. So I'm very curious about your explanation for this.
Okay, any...
I didn't get all of it either, I'm afraid. I do explain the attempt to create a unitary group in the European Parliament.
Yes, and why the Danish People's Party and the Finns sign up to this now?
I think you asked something about, can a democracy exist and is not liberal democracy? Yeah, I mean, nowadays we tend to conceive of democracy only as liberal democracy. I guess you can conceive of an electoral democracy in which you have free and fair elections that take place at regular intervals in time, where it's some kind of populist democracy in which the principle of delivering the will of the majority of the day is regarded as paramount, and therefore in which the idea of all these considerable constraints placed on the power of the executive is seen as not particularly desirable. It's not a democracy I particularly like, but if democracy is the rule of the people and we understand it as the rule of the majority, I guess you can conceive of some kind of democracy that is not necessarily the one that I guess most people in the room, including myself, would regard as desirable. Neoliberal depends many things. It means many things, neoliberal. Of course, you can have, and we've had them in Europe, populists that push a neoliberal economic model, and that is what we've had with the original Lega or the Austrian Freedom Party, or indeed initially, apparently, Berlusconi's Forza Italia. I say apparently because in actual fact, Berlusconi has never pushed policies that are really comparable to those of, for instance, Margaret Thatcher. But in terms of, I was talking about the kind of political dimension. In my view, populism and liberalism are incompatible. So you cannot have liberal populists. In fact, I don't think Berlusconi's Forza Italia has ever been a liberal populist party. I think it's not radical like Salvini's Lega or indeed many other parties around Europe, but it's never been liberal, and it cannot be liberal in my view. There are many reasons why a group of nationalist populists or populist radical right parties should be created in the European Union from their perspective. One is obviously there are very good practical reasons and financial incentives to creating a unitary group, so if you can do it, why not? And I can absolutely see why Salvini wants to be seen as the leader of that. My view is fundamentally for domestic reasons. He wants to be able to say that once upon a time it was him running after Le Pen, which is true, still in 2014, and now it's Le Pen inviting him for dinner. He wants to be able to say that Italy is now at the very center of the fight against globalism and this idea that migrants are coming to get us, and Italy is now very much at the heart of this resistance. And so the event is going to take place soon in Italy. There is another event taking place in a demonstration. It will be very important for him to show that, in fact, there are even more parties now joining. But what I argue is that, number one, yes, some of them will come together, but I don't expect all of them to do for the reasons that I've indicated. Second, even if they do, they may well continue to vote very differently, which is what has happened with Five Star and UKIP. I mean, you can create a group and get the money and all the advantages, but that doesn't mean you are going to create a common front. And on some issues, they cannot create a common front, apart from Russia. But of course, when it comes to redistributing asylum seekers or migrants, immediately Hungary will say to Italy, you keep them, and Italy will say to Austria, can you have some? And Austria will say, no. So the problem is, of course, that apart from Russia or foreign policy, there are also national interests that these parties perceive as being very important, and also they want to be re-elected. But it's interesting that until recently, many of these parties didn't want to be seen having anything to do with the other parties. They were in reality very similar to them. So when the Lega was led by Bossi, he used to say, Le Pen, I can't even, stand his name, Le Pen father. He's a fascist. And of course, in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, a lot of these parties have been very keen to say, well, we're not like Le Pen, we're not the Front National. I remember a time when Farage was saying, I got nothing to do with the Front National. Before then, 2 or 3 years ago, 2 years ago, he actually interviewed Marine Le Pen saying, you're doing great work, but it's because you get radicalized. But there was a time, not many years ago, in which these parties had every interest to pretend that there weren't any kind of similarities between them. Because the thing is that in every country, the media portray these parties outside the country as being very radical, while the party might already have been normalized. So the other example is Italy, where members of the Lega can say very radical things. But then when people talk about Le Pen or Wilders, it's like if they were talking about a neo-Nazi, but when you analyze the speeches are very, very similar, the arguments are very similar. So it is, I agree that there has been movement, and it is interesting that they are trying to create something, and I think some of them will come together, but number one, not all of them will. Number two, they will not vote the same way. Number three, for reasons also related to their ideology, I think that on many issues they will continue to clash. Why is Italy a populist paradise? That's a very, very good question. I don't think it's about the political system particularly. I think it's, after the collapse of the old party system with the disappearance of Christian democracy, the old Socialist Party, was a period in which there was a kind of great hope that things would change, and of course Berlusconi interpreted that very well. What we have seen in the last 3 decades, certainly 25 years, is a country in decline in economic terms, but also a country in which, for a number of reasons, political elites have done everything but been seen addressing very, very important problems that the country is facing. So after this period in which people thought Berlusconi would kind of usher in a new era, what we have seen is the continuous rehearsing of very similar arguments, except that the populist party changes and the alleged elites may change their names, but the argument is always the same. Berlusconi took to the pitch of politics using the same arguments basically that have been used by Five Star 20 years later. It is in this constant frustration, the inability of the political system to address the problems, and I think it's also in part this generational now clash that is really destroying public and social life in Italy, because a generation of people who are between like 18 and indeed 40, 45, so including people who are not particularly young, in my view has been crushed. They've been crushed for at least 2 decades. And this is very obvious. I mean, this has political consequences that are very serious. Initially, Five Star was a party of young people. It's very serious because there's very widespread lack of hope and certainly total lack of faith in the political system and political parties.
Okay, thank you. There might be 2 more questions. One from György Kocsis. Please come, György, here, because then Daniele can hear you better very close to the laptop. Now we know what's working or not.
I can hear your microphone now.
Yeah, because I'm very close. Yeah, and György is here, another vice chairwoman of the Hungarian Europe Society and journalist. Please go ahead.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can now.
Yes. I'm sorry, I would like to return to István's question, which he asked the first time, and it's not only because we belong to the same NGO, but it really interests me what you said about making, if I understood it well, making a distinction between democracy or populist democracy and liberal democracy. Now, for me, it seems that a populist democracy is either cannot exist or it's unsustainable. Let me illustrate you with this with the Hungarian example. Mr. Orbán says that Hungary is or should be a populist, illiberal populist. He doesn't use the word populist, but he says illiberal democracy. The will of the majority is going to be executed. Now, the will of the majority seems to be, and it has been expressed very obviously by the government media or quite extreme government media, but still government media, that we don't want the gypsies, we don't want the Roma people to exist in this country. Or, if we cannot eliminate them, at least we don't want to give them the same rights as the majority have. And in practice, of course, on paper they do have the same rights, but in practice they are second-rate citizens. Now, this seems to be the will of the majority. So, what if the will of the majority is that let us extinguish minorities? Is that a democracy? And let's say that the will of the people is executed and the minorities are extinguished, and that there could be another small minority being born in the country, and the majority again says that let's extinguish now this other minority. I wonder if you understand my extreme example, but this is I don't think you can call this minority a democracy, this is an unsustainable system, or it turns very fast into dictatorship. So my question is my logic wrong, or where is the problem here? Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, Daniele, I have
to answer that? Yeah.
I have a second question, and maybe that's all because we are running out of time. Could you please tell us whether there is a sort of hope in Italy that any non-populist parties or groups or civil society might help to change the situation, and maybe non-populists get into power sooner or later, or we have to live with that situation for a long period ahead?
Okay. Right, so concerning the first question, I actually agree. I wasn't suggesting, I say it again, that a populist democracy is a system I particularly like. If a state starts getting rid of its non-citizens, then it fails in one of the fundamental duties of the state. So if we start talking about, deportation, we are really talking about a different situation. What I was suggesting is that you can have a populist democracy in which the varying majorities that you have are seen as being allowed by the fact that they are a majority to implement certain programs. But of course, if we are talking about a kind of neo-Nazi system in which minorities will then be executed, then we are talking about a different situation, because you have a state that kind of turns against some of its own citizens. I was thinking of a situation in which you have free and fair elections, and in which the majority of the day is, to an extent, seen as empowered by having win elections to implement programs which goes beyond, let's say, the very many, in my view, necessary limitations that are placed on this right by the mechanism of liberal democracy. But I wasn't suggesting it's desirable. I'm just suggesting that you can conceive of democracy in different ways. I mean, the way it was conceived in Greece is clearly not the way when it originated, clearly not the way it is conceived today. Even the demos was very, very different from what usually Democrats say the demos needs to be today. In terms of Italy, I think Italy is very resilient. It has a very good constitution, and even Berlusconi, despite having been prime minister 4 times, didn't manage to change it. And when one looks at Berlusconi's legacy, is mainly in the realm of discourse and rhetoric than in having inflicted fundamental changes to Italy. Very many of the things he tried to change he couldn't do, either because of the intervention of the courts or because of the balance of power, checks and balances, or the reaction of civil society. So I don't think Berlusconi has been able to leave a very deep legacy. In terms of today, as I said, I think the real threat is very, very deep-seated feeling of anger, which is in large part, in my view, justified towards the political elites. The problem is that populists do not always make up things. The populists sometimes work with things that are very real. And in Italy, political elites have abandoned whole generations of people and whole regions within the country. I mean, southern regions have been abandoned since the age of unification. So this anger, which is very real, is also, in my view, quite well justified. But of course, it does generate then a level of detachment from the political system that is dangerous. Are other forces going to react? I think there is a small chance, I think it's small, but it exists, that the current centre-left will finally get its act together. The reason why I'm saying this is that it seems to me that the new leader has understood a number of things that have determined their lack of success in recent years. First and foremost, the need for the centre-left to start taking seriously the needs of people at the bottom of society or working people that, as I said, has been crushed now for 2 or 3 decades. There has been a period recently in which the centre-left was quite happy to be seen as having become the party of the middle class. So the people who need support started looking at the Five Star to find support. And they ran a fantastic campaign in 2018, drawing a lot from classical social democratic rhetoric to win that election. So I think there is a small chance in the sense that I can see the Democratic Party kind of changing at the moment. Whether it's going to be in the very near future, I don't think so. I think the next election is going to be won by Salvini, and the next government in Italy will be a right-wing government with Salvini prime minister. But in the medium term, I think that something is changing and is moving.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation, and the very last half sentence of yours was maybe more encouraging than anything before. Thank you, Daniela, for joining us, and it was a great presentation, and it was a very special event for us to have you here through Skype, and I hope we will have another opportunity soon. So thank you again, and see you maybe in person sooner or later.